All right. So this first idea of Ito's that I really love was that your spine is you. Ito asks us to think about what what region of our body is most essential. What can we really not live without? And he made a great point saying that you can get by pretty good uh, after having an injury or an accident in which you lose a hand, a foot, a leg. Obviously, that's a struggle, but there is a part of your body which you can't really move without, and that's your spine. The spine is the mother organizer of all movement in your body, and given that it plays such a structural role and neurological role, obviously, in carrying the information to move the rest of your body, we really need to make sure that we're spending a lot of time maintaining and utilizing that structure so that it moves and functions optimally. Something that here in New England are cold climates where people are in office chairs a lot, driving around a lot, they're not getting a lot of movement in their spine. They're not exploring ranges of motion in their spine other than maybe leaning slightly forward, curving forward. So, how do we get more more mobility into our spines? And where do we start? So Ito's whole structure with anything he does, at least all the stuff I've done, is this framework of isolation, integration, and improvisation. So basically, you do an isolated task, be it strength or mobility, and then you're going to bring that into a bigger movement. You're going to integrate it in, and then you're going to use all that skill that you've built, mobility or strength that you've built, and use it in an improvisational game. So when we were working on the spine, we started small. We started to go into one area of the spine. And Ito argued for improving mobility in the T-spine to be especially important. Again, in our culture where we are hunched over a lot, we're constantly sitting, this is an area where people tend to be really hyperflexed, or sometimes they're compensating so much that they become really flat in the T-spine. But regardless, we see a lot of dysfunction here, but it's also incredibly difficult to mobilize. So that's why Ito really wanted us to zero in and spend a lot of time trying to mobilize this area. One of the reasons it's particularly difficult to mobilize is because it's so easy to compensate with your lumbar or cervical spine. You can think you're mobilizing your T-spine, but actually you might just be borrowing flexion and extension from your lumbar. So in our mobility work, I won't give you, like the exact exercise we did, but in our mobility work, all the stuff that we did really involved locking down via, tension in your body, locking down your lumbars and locking down your cervicals, and then exploring movement in the T-spine, which is surprisingly difficult to control. And one point that Ito made is that people oftentimes are looking to feel the movement, and because they're looking to feel the movement, they'll over exaggerate the movement rather than doing the right movement. So they will borrow from their lumbar and cervical spine just to get that appearance or that feeling that they have range of motion when actually they may not. So he made the point that to really focus on doing the actual movement, even if it is in a very, very small, minuscule range of motion, because he was arguing that, this, even if you are barely improving the range of motion in the T-spine, if it's barely noticeable, that micro gain in movement that region is so important to your overall movement that a micro gain there can produce a macro gain in your overall movement capacity. So, given that mobility that we worked on, we moved on to his integration stage. And to do that, we did the spinal wave, which you may have seen Conor McGregor doing a lot in his work with Ito. Uh, this is a thing that Ito's become quite famous for, but we just did a simple wave, moving our spine in flexion and extension from the sacrum all the way through the lumbar, thoracic, the cervical, up to the head. Just moving very sequentially in this way. So again, we're taking that mobility that we gained in the isolation stage in the T-spine and integrating it into a larger pattern. This pattern, this wave pattern, is just one of many waves that the spine can do, of course. This wave is something that's important to the locomotion of quadrupeds. Like if you look at a cheetah running around, it's using this flexion and extension wave as it speeds across the savanna. If you look at a alligator or a fish, you'll see that they utilize spinal waves, but they're actually not going to be moving in this flexion and extension. They're going to be waving in lateral flexion and extension. For us, the walkers, the bipeds, the runners, rotation is super important for us because that allows us this contralateral movement. So basically, what I'm trying to say here is that while we just focused on this flexion and extension wave and improving mobility there, that's really just one of many variations. And in order to have a very functional spine as a human, you need to be able to wave in all these different ways and be able to flex, extend, laterally flex, side bend, and rotate as well. And again, this is also based off our structural anatomy. One thing I learned from studying with Tom and his tensegrity spine course is that the structure of the individual vertebrae in the different regions of your back dictates what sort of movements those regions do. And this is all based off the orientation of the facet joints, which are the sticky outy bits on the back of your spine. So based on how those sticky outy bits are oriented is going to allow certain types of mobility and restrict others. So down in the lumbars, we have a lot of flexion and extension. We've got a little bit of side bending ability, lateral flexion, but we have almost no rotation. In the T-spine, we have a little bit of flexion and extension. We've got pretty good side bending ability, but we have really good rotational ability and mobility there. And then up in the cervical, one could argue that's our most mobile region of spine. You've got a lot of flexion and extension, almost as much as the lumbars. You've got pretty good lateral flexion, side bending, and you've got really good rotational ability there. So we're seeing that in different regions of the spine, our vertebrae are predisposed to move in certain ways. So this is another reason why it's super important to, not just move your spine in one direction, but work in many planes. And of course, knowing Ito, this is not what he's arguing for. The integration stage and the flexion extension wave that we did was just one pattern. But of course, we're going to improvise and bring that pattern into a more complex, dynamic situation. So using his games, which I won't give away, we started to explore patterns that made us wave the spine, and not just in this flexion extension way, but in all these strange ways of rotating and also flexing, and not just laterally flexing, but having flexion in certain spots of our spine and a little bit of rotation at the top. So doing these games will get you to sort of adopt all these interesting little corners and configurations of your spine. And that is the beauty of your spine, is that it can organize in all these super complex ways. We did this for a really long time, and by the end of it, you're feeling incredibly relaxed, very sort of meditative and flow-like, but your spine and your whole back is incredibly free. So since this, anytime that I start to experience a little bit of tension building up in the back, I always go straight to the spinal wave, in different directions, going in these different fish-like ways, these rotational patterns, and then also the classic front to back spinal wave as well. And by the end of it, my back feels way more free. And you can do this for a surprisingly long time. Once you go in past minute 3 or so, you're really starting to find your flow, and you just want to keep it going and keep it going and keep it going. But of course, while I think it is important to, like Ito says, build these skills and then integrate them into better patterns so that we can use them in games, I just want to emphasize that one important thing to do is never forget to play, never forget to use these patterns in these complex ways. So you can not only do Ito's sorts of games, but you can also just dance. Just wave that spine around on a salsa floor, or go to a yoga class. There's a lot of good side bending and flexion and all that within the practice of yoga. However, I would argue that it's not complex enough. So, but that's of course up to you. If you do your own style, you can make it a little bit more complex, a little more playful. You can also go surfing. You could do jiu-jitsu. Of course, problem with something like jiu-jitsu is that you're adopting all these strange configurations with your spine, often under load, which could be problematic as well. But at least you're getting into those more interesting corners of your spine, and you're building this functional mobility within the spine. And that functional mobility within the spine, however you get it, my preferred way, maybe dancing or jiu-jitsu, but however you get it, that's going to keep you especially young and youthful. Remember, your spine is you.